Okay, this is the lecture on genocide, part 3. We'll pick up where we left off last time. Remember, there was a number of different factors that influence whether a genocide happens or not, and how extreme and severe the genocide is. One of those factors was mobility. A degree of mobility must be present for violence to occur. Genocide is expected to increase with greater immobility. Let's make sure I say that right. Immobility, meaning that it's not easy for a population to move around. So if you live in some place that's sort of isolated, secluded, some place where there's maybe transportation is not really available, there's a greater likelihood for a genocide to happen, because if you have this powerful population, powerful government that has this grievance against a weaker group and is motivated to commit violence against them, well, the weaker group might be able to avoid that, to escape that, through fleeing, through leaving. And that's what you see a lot with refugees, is refugees running away from some potentially genocidal threat. And so that's what often happens, is you see refugees around the world trying to flee danger and violence. But if transportation is not readily available, if there are things blocking the ability to escape, well, then the genocide is more likely to occur. Of course, in the case of, say, the Holocaust, World War II, if you have victims who are imprisoned and are physically immobile, if you're incarcerated, then of course you're sort of trapped, and it's a difficult thing to be able to flee if you have people who are motivated to hurt you. An example of this, the population was sparse enough and Jews were small enough group to expel them in medieval Europe, but not so Nazi Germany. So the point that they're making, that the folks are making here, is that you had a small enough and isolated enough population of the Jewish community in medieval Europe that you saw governments just simply expel the Jewish population from their country. For example, you must leave England by such and such date, or you must leave France by such and such a date. And that was sort of, so there was a readily available exit in that case. But in the case of Nazi Germany, you had the Germans who were taking over many countries, not just controlling Germany, but many other countries, as they were, militaristically aggressive and going from country to country. And all of these countries had Jewish populations, and there was no clear place to send the Jewish people to expel the Jewish people to. The Nazis had talked about potentially exiling or kicking out Jews and sending them to Madagascar, a large island off the coast of Eastern Africa, but there were problems why that ended up not being a realistic possibility. So when you see this sorts of lack of opportunity for kicking people out physically to go someplace else, then genocide becomes more likely. As populations have grown and territories have filled up, genocide is more likely. So again, if you have a country with lots of room and lots of sparsely populated territories, well, if the government has a problem with minority population, what you often see was that they will drive these folks, or kick these folks out to this less desirable territory, less populated territory, and you've seen that throughout history as well, that a lot of times these weaker groups will end up being pushed into less desirable lands, and that will be the quote unquote the solution for this problem as the government sees it. You saw that to some extent in American history, where Native Americans were pushed off their traditionally occupied lands onto other lands, less desirable lands, onto reservations, and when there's that kind of opportunity, then the chances for violence, for genocide, for killing people goes down. So again, is there free available sparsely populated territory or not? An example here is the genocide of Native Americans, so I just spoke of this, increased as European presence grew. California saw the worst genocidal massacres. The Native population fell from 100,000 to only 35,000 between 1849 and 1860. See, so in the earlier days of this conflict, as Europeans came to dominate in terms of population and power in the western states, more and more the native populations were pushed west, and that there was less genocidal activity during that earlier period, because you still had all of these western territories where natives ended up sort of moving from place to place. They're being pushed from place to place. But once you reached California, then you had the West Coast, you had the ocean. All the territory was becoming used up, was becoming occupied by various peoples. And so when there was less this sort of free open territory, you saw greater genocidal numbers in California, and later on in this process. Here you see these numbers, these significant fall in numbers over a relatively short period of time. One thing we do need to say about when we see these, very troubling, horrible numbers, loss of people, is that one of the really tragic things about the European movement of peoples into the Americas was that they brought with them diseases like, say, for example, smallpox, that the natives had no immunity to. They had no experience with these Eurasian diseases, and so that actually killed the vast majority of native populations, not only in North America, but Central and South America as well. That devastated and killed many more people than this violent genocidal behavior, but it's all horrible. It's all a horrible thing. So just keep that in mind when you see the numbers, that the greatest percentage of that came actually through disease, and most of which was, you hear stories about intentional transmission of disease from the European to Native American populations, but most of the time this was not an intentional, deliberate thing. It was just a natural. You carry certain diseases in your population, and if another population has no immunities to these diseases, it really can be devastating to those populations. Anyway, cultural distance refers to cultural diversity, or differences in the content of culture. I think that's an interesting, an accurate sort of concept that you can look at different groups of people and say, okay, how, culturally speaking, in terms of heritage, language, religion, sense of self-identity, how far apart are groups of people, or how close together are they? So, for example, if you had I don't know, just random examples. If you looked at the English and the Irish, they've had plenty of troubles in their histories, conflict in their histories. So you might think of them as being culturally very different from each other. The Irish, for example, typically Roman Catholic, and English typically Protestant. But when they come to the United States, immigrants coming from England or Ireland to the United States, all of a sudden in that context, the cultural difference might be much smaller than between those two groups, English-speaking groups that lived similar, next to each other and had long histories together and exchanged a lot. So you might find that those populations in the American context are much closer together than, say, the English and, Russian immigrants, for example, that have a different language, completely different language, different history, very different culture in many ways, different religion, mostly Russian Orthodox folks, so different religious traditions. So you can kind of get a measure how close or how far people are apart in terms of these cultural aspects. Ethnic groups that have the same religion, for instance, are culturally closer than those that do not. So when you talk about ethnicity, there's multiple dimensions. We've kind of mentioned those before. Language, religion, customs, food, clothing, on and on, very long list. Histories, and even the racial aspect, how people look, that kind of thing. And so ethnic groups that have religion, of course, is traditionally, historically, a very important sense of identity and a sense of a source of culture. And so certainly religion is something that if you have the same religion, it brings people closer together than those that don't share the same religion. And those with similar religions, such as different branches of Christianity or Islam, are closer than those with less similar religions. So again, you can kind of think of a spectrum here that people can fall along this continuum, being either closer or further apart. And it's complicated because there's various dimensions. Here we just focus on religion. Some cultural degree. Now this is this theory, and also what research tells us, that there's typically, or the research states it quite strongly, that some degree of cultural distance must be present for genocide to occur. Ethnic distinctions must exist. Plural societies in which various groups are very different and separate provide the structural base for genocide. Now let's break this down a little more. What is meant by this highlighted point is that what you see in history is if groups are culturally really similar to each other, but they have conflicts, that the government, that the powerful group or groups, that they tend to find less severe, harsh, extreme ways to deal with these, perceived grievances and problems that they perceive with the minority group. And so if there's a lot of similarities between the two cultures, you can see violence, you can see, some violations of human rights, that kind of thing. But it's usually not people don't get to such an extreme point that they say, okay, we're going to wipe out these people that we consider to be their enemies. They're usually going to take a less extreme form if they feel some level of similarity, cultural similarity with the other group. So that's something and this is a conclusion that's been drawn based on a survey of history, scanning across historical incidents to find out when the genocides happen and when they don't. Usually when the genocides happen, the people, the majority group, the powerful group, the government, is culturally very distinctive from the victims. And so this cultural distance contributes to the likelihood of genocide occurring. Where physical differences between groups, such as differences in color, these sorts of things that we typically think of when we think of racial differences, when these physical differences are linked up with markers of ethnicity, ethnicity is easier to identify. These visible racial sort of characteristics, skin tone, etc. These are one thing that makes them significant is they're very visible. They're obvious that you don't have to talk to somebody. You can look at them and say, oh, this person seems to be from a different group from me. So these are easy to identify characteristics. They're harder to change. They're more permanent characteristics, the ascribed characteristics that we mentioned before. And so they're harder to change or disguise. They're out there. They're very visible and in the open. And so greater visibility tends to raise the risk of genocide. So if the differences are quite visible, clear, not something that you can hide if, let's say, you're motivated to try to get along with another group. And so you might be motivated to try to blend in and try to not seem so different from this out group. But if you physically look different, well, that's something that you're not going to be able to hide. And so this can be used against you by this aggressive, violent majority group. So again, you see that there's different dimensions: cultural, religious, ethnic, racial, that the more that they signal difference, the greater the chance that you see this extreme form of conflict in that we're focusing on here, genocide. Now, an example. Despite many similarities between British imperial expansion into Ireland and North America, British relations with the Irish were less genocidal than relations with the more culturally distant American Indians. The British, looks like I'm missing a word there, made more attempts at assimilation with the Irish. See, so this is a historical example where you can see that the British were more inclined to take less extreme measures in dealing with the Irish than they did with Native Americans. And so why was this? Because they looked at the people of Ireland and they said, well, these folks, yes, there's differences. They're Roman Catholic, we're Protestants. They speak Gaelic, a different language than English. So yes, there's differences. But at the same time, they're Christians like we are. They kind of look like us. There's not much physical differences noticeable between the groups. We've had a long history with them. We live next to them, and so we've had a lot of sharing of cultural aspects. So there's some cultural closeness from that. So we're going to deal with these people in less harsh terms, although there's plenty of atrocities that British committed against the Irish, but you didn't see full scale, this extreme, this genocidal behavior like you saw with the British in the Americas with natives, who they didn't see as having much cultural commonality. So they said they told themselves, these natives look different than us. They're speaking a different language than us. They seem to have a culture and a way of life that's in their minds. They thought of them as being radically different. They look different. They dress different. So that in the minds of the perpetrators of these crimes, of these human rights violations, sort of helps. It makes it easy for people to do things like to dehumanize and demean people and say, well, they're not the same as us. They're not equal to us. They're inferiors. They're savages. They're subhuman. And then you get this in the extreme situations. You get this dehumanization by calling people, subhuman names, vermin and insects and dehumanizing sorts of names, that kind of thing. So again, that's facilitated by cultural differences of different types, related types. Let's see. Let's stop it right there. We're about 20 minutes into the video, and we'll start up with part 4.